Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 353. This week the questions are taken from Guide 423 on the Visby class destroyers of the Swedish Navy, the video on who had the best torpedoes of World War II, and the Friday video on generations of battleships. So let's begin. BK Zhong asks, would you argue that every post-1935 class of battleship is a heavily armoured derivation of the battlecruiser, as accomplished much earlier by HMS Hood? I can kind of see where you're going there because, as I discussed a while back in a video, Hood does tick an awful lot of boxes for a fast battleship, even though she's commonly called a battlecruiser. I'm not sure I would say that every 1930s and onward battleship is a heavily armoured derivation of the battlecruiser, because while Hood very definitely does, as I said, tick lots of boxes for a fast battleship, there are a few things, if you go into the wider meta of what is a battleship, where you could argue that Hood is still a battlecruiser. And I would specifically look at where she stands in relation to other capital ships of the time, because although she has a fairly convoluted design history, ultimately she is essentially, armament-wise and protection-wise, a Queen Elizabeth, but really fast. But that makes her essentially the same in armour and protection and firepower as the previous generation of battleship. So if you accept that battleships should iterate on each other, so each successive class should in some way be an improvement on the previous one, and battleships primarily focus on protection and firepower as opposed to speed, whereas battlecruisers obviously focus more on speed, then you could argue that therefore Hood is the battlecruiser of the Queen Elizabeths, and the Queen Elizabeths were halfway to being battlecruisers themselves anyway, in that she represents a generation, or maybe two build generations, more advanced technology, but she doesn't improve on the armour and the protection of those previous ships. Whereas, if you look at, the battleship building with the Revenge class is a bit of a weird aside, but also in Germany and so forth, you're generally looking at advances in firepower and protection at least every two generations, if not every single generation. And yes, you could argue that by the 1930s, everybody's moving at the high 20s of knots as a minimum, and therefore this is more reflective of battlecruiser speeds. But at the same time, battleships are designed around the speed that all the other battleships are supposed to be doing. And if everybody, thanks to propulsion technology advances, is doing 27 to 28 knots, then that has now become the new 21 knots, the World War I battle line speed. And of course, the whole argument as to what is a battlecruiser and what is a battleship is narrowing and overlapping very much during this time period. So initially you have, of course, the Royal Navy initially calling the King George V's battlecruisers because they're faster than 25 knots, and for a very long time they persist in calling Vanguard a fully armoured battlecruiser, a lot longer than it takes them to decide that King George V is in fact a battleship. So although, broadly speaking, using the terms that were used for the ships at the time is probably a relatively decent idea, although of course there's the whole argument of whether the Scharnhorst are battleships or battlecruisers, but that aside, I think if you're going to look at the post-treaty and treaty battleships, or capital ships shall we say, as either battleship successors or possibly extremely heavily armoured battlecruiser derivations, aka more Hood descendant than Queen Elizabeth or Colorado descendant, then I suppose you could make an argument that you have to look at where is the priority, like I said before. So if the priority is firepower and protection, then you would probably expect the ship to be doing 27, 28 knots. And you can see that in something like, say, Yamato, where they did have options to go faster with a slightly lighter armament, but they decided to sacrifice speed in favour of protection and firepower. That's a classic battleship decision. But then you get to ships like, let's say, the Littorios and Bismarck, where they have made a decision that they want to go faster than the average, around about 30 knots. Same with Vanguard, for that matter. And at that point, you could, in theory, make an argument that maybe these are more extremely heavily armoured battlecruiser derivatives because they could, for their displacement, have had better protection or more firepower or both if they had restricted themselves to going to 27 to 28 knots, but they chose to sacrifice some small element of that for greater speed, which is more of a battlecruiser decision. Now, you'll note I didn't include the Richelieus in that because the Richelieus are in the slightly odd position, thanks to the artificial circulation or forced circulation boilers that the French use, of being able to hit higher speeds than average without particularly having to sacrifice firepower or protection compared to some of the early design documents, and still coming in at roughly treaty displacement. And that's when you loop back round to the point I made in the sort of Hood versus Iowa debate video, where Iowa, it starts off as essentially South Dakota, but fast. Kind of like Hood ends up being Queen Elizabeth, but fast. And you could even make an argument that the fact that Hood has, okay, she doesn't get, 45 or 50 caliber 15-inch guns, but she gets additional elevation to her guns straight from the outset, is kind of similar to the way that Iowa eventually, or the Iowa class eventually, end up with 50 caliber 16-inch guns instead of 45 caliber. A little bit more firepower in exchange for the fact that you're essentially having the same ship, just much bigger and more expensive in exchange for speed. And that is, again, more of a battlecruiser decision. But it kind of highlights just how close the fast battleship and the heavily armoured battlecruiser had become by that point. Captain Charlemagne asks, someone told me that Arizona should have been stateside on December 7th. However, the US Navy had fallen behind on maintenance on some of its capital ships, with USS Colorado, for example, should have had been worked on earlier in the year. Is this true? There's a kernel of truth in that, but it's broadly not correct. So the kernel of truth is, yes, Arizona theoretically should have been stateside on December 7th in Bremerton. However, it's nothing to do with the modernization of the Colorado and so forth. The modernization of Colorado was due to the US program, which was essentially to modernize and retain what they called the Big Five. So that would be the 3 Colorados and the 2 Tennessees for a while they essentially modernized their battleship fleet over to entirely fast battleships. And as the fast battleship came into service, the other battleships, so the Arkansas, the New York and Texas, and then the various other standards, so the Nevadas, the Pennsylvanias, including Arizona, and the New Mexicos, would be disposed of with the Big Five retained, and then they would eventually go once the fast battleships were available in large enough numbers, with, of course, the modernization and refit that Colorado was undergoing, amongst others, being designed to keep them around and operational for that length of time, similar to what the Royal Navy had started doing with the Queen Elizabeths and the battlecruisers. But that schedule was a separate schedule than the one that Arizona was supposed to be on. Arizona was due to head over to Bremerton for a refit and overhaul, not as extensive a one as the Colorado, but still something to bring a little bit more up to date. Unfortunately, while she was still at Pearl Harbor, she went out on a fleet exercise in late October 1941, and, well, not really her fault, but the USS Oklahoma missed a signal to turn, ended up ramming the Arizona. It wasn't that bad damage, it wasn't Camperdown versus Victoria style damage, but it was enough damage that Arizona needed to be dry docked in Pearl Harbor to be repaired, and that meant that she missed her sailing slot to head over to Bremerton, at which point both she and Oklahoma obviously were still in Pearl Harbor on December 7th when the Japanese attacked. So if it hadn't been for that collision, with Oklahoma, then Arizona would have been in Bremerton and therefore wouldn't have exploded, but it has nothing to do with the general maintenance schedule of the US Navy and the Colorado refit in particular. Jason W. Key asks, if the UK government allocates funding in 1935 to do an immediate upgrade of all the R-class to be completed by 39, how would you do it and what would the refit look like? Well, the immediate problem in practical terms is it's going to have to be an absolutely massive check, because you're going to be occupying, assuming you're keeping the other modernisation programs going at the same time, plus the building programs, you're going to be occupying a huge amount of the UK's capital grade dockyards. In fact, I'm not necessarily sure there are enough of them, at least for the kind of refits you'd want to do. So the reason I say the check's going to have to be really, really big is because you're probably going to have to reopen a few of the closed down yards as well. Now, fortunately, you've said it has to be completed by 39 and we're starting in 35. And even a full modernisation, like you see for Warspite, Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, doesn't quite take that long. So assuming that we start everybody in 35, we in theory have plenty of time. Now, of course, this does run into one other rather major issue, which is that if Warspite's already gone in, she went in 34, so if we're taking all of the Revenge class offline as well, and then presuming that we keep the refit schedule for renowned Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, at some point you're going to end up with the Royal Navy having a fleet that consists of Repulse, Barham, Malaya, and Hood, Nelson and Rodney, and that's the battle fleet, which, realistically speaking, people may not necessarily be happy with. So I suppose you could stagger it slightly and start some in 35 and start some in 36, and you'd still get everyone in the water by 39. But you're still going to have, maybe a couple of years there where you're going to have a dramatically low number of battleships. But again, for the sake of argument, we're going to assume that all of this is hand-waved away. Now, one of the fundamental problems that the R-class had during World War II was their propulsion systems. Their machinery was basically on death's door. So that immediately sets a baseline. We're going to have to replace the boilers, at the very least, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. We can replace them with modern up-to-date boilers like they did with the various Queen Elizabeth refits. But if you're going to do that, that means cutting down most of the superstructure and so forth, so it's going to be a long job, at which point you might as well do a bunch of other things as well. The trade-off here is that these ships are smaller and therefore less useful and have a lower performance threshold to start with than the QEs. So you don't want to spend infinite money, because ultimately they are supposed to come out of commission under the revised Royal Navy schedule when the Lion class commissions in the sort of 1942 to 43 period. So as well as the machinery upgrades or replacements, what I would do, I wouldn't necessarily try and improve the torpedo defense system all that much. They've already been bulged, as you can see here with Royal Oak. And yeah, it's not perfect, but it would be vastly more complicated and expensive to do considerably better. I would put a small bow extension on, Italian style, to help with speed and sea keeping. Increase the elevation of the gun turrets to 30 degrees. That's a fairly easy way to buy a bunch of additional range without having to use supercharges. Stick in maybe a little bit of additional deck armour, just for bombs and so forth. But now we run into the problem of them being smaller than the Queen Elizabeth. There's not as much deck space. So luckily, we've ripped apart the superstructure to get at the machinery. So redo the superstructure. I would remove the conning tower. That'll save you a bunch of weight. Strip out all the casement guns as well, and kind of fair in that section of the hull like they did with Queen Elizabeth and Valiant. And then with the saved weight, put in a Queen Anne's Mansion style forward superstructure. And that, in turn, should allow me to trim back the aft superstructure quite considerably, which should make space down the sides. Now, I'm not going to put in twin 4.5s, partly because of weight, partly because of the complexity of the between-deck mounts, and partly just because I don't think there's going to be as much space as there would be on Queen Elizabeth and Valiant. Instead, for economy, speed, and fit, I'm actually just going to put as many twin 4-inch in as I possibly can. So the same kind of gun you'll see on HMS Belfast, for example. And I think I should comfortably be able to get 5 twin mounts in, possibly 6, but I would probably safely bet on 5. About the only annoying thing is it's just fractionally too early to include radar in the actual modernization that we're doing, rather than have it done later on, but that would be the broad scope of what I'd do. Alex asks, after your video on the decapping belt of the Littorio class battleship, I was wondering, would the County class have had something similar occur with its main box citadel and the armour around the machinery spaces, or have I got it a bit wrong how it worked? And if not, what size shell should it have been able to stop? So the layout of the County class's armour is a little bit different to what you're imagining, because I understand when you say, an armoured box around the magazines, you think, right, that's got to be internal, and then you've got presumably a much lighter external belt, which could act as a decapping plate. And yes, if they'd done that, then you would have had that effect. However, unfortunately, it wasn't like that. The first generation of County class, the armoured box around the citadel, consisting of armoured sides, deck, bulkheads, etc. Yes, it's a box, but it's a box in the overall grand scheme of things. So the side armour does actually come all the way out to the side of the ship. Therefore, it's effectively a discontinuous belt, where you have a section of armour over the aft magazines, a section of armour over the forward magazines, and then a gap in between, as opposed to normally where you'd have the armour run continuously, which is what you would also have once they've been refitted. Over the machinery, there's a separate 1-inch thick, which is essentially just splinter proofing and long-range destroyer gunfire proofing, bit of, not necessarily, I wouldn't even call it armour, just protection, shall we say. And so there wouldn't be any decapping events going on because the two armour sections are in completely separate portions of the ship. And the reason they adopted that was essentially with the treaty limitations. If you wanted the speed, you wanted the range, and you wanted the firepower that a heavy cruiser was supposed to provide. So in the County class's case, obviously that's 8-inch guns, etc. They came to the conclusion, well, if you're actually going to stick to the displacement limits, you can somewhat poorly armour the ship everywhere, i.e. you could make a heavy cruiser that's proof against destroyer grade guns, and maybe, if you're very lucky, some of the weaker 6-inch guns, but against a peer opponent it will be completely vulnerable. Or you can concentrate the armour in certain areas and make those areas proof against 8-inch gunfire at battle ranges, but you're going to have to sacrifice something elsewhere. And their decision was, well, if the magazines get hit, ship goes boom, so we will armour the magazines, and then whatever weight is left, we'll potentially look at adding a little bit here and there over the rest of the ship, hence 1-inch plating over the machinery. And yes, that would theoretically render the ship vulnerable to a hit amidships knocking out the machinery in the event of a fight with another heavy cruiser, but they countered that, well, firstly, given the ranges they're expecting to fight at, they'd included some reasonable deck protection for the machinery, so hopefully the shells would hit the deck, and the machinery was set quite low in the ship, so there was hopefully, again, a small margin where a shell could enter from the side and go through and wreck the machinery. But also, even if some of the machinery was wrecked, that was bad, but it was nowhere near as bad as your magazines detonating. At some point, I do need to do a video on the development of the County class, because it is fascinating looking at the various kinds of armour scheme that they consulted to try and fully protect the ship while staying under the weight limit. At one point, they even looked at just putting all the machinery and all the magazines as deep as they possibly could in the ship and purely having an armoured deck, which would obviously then, theoretically, at least with a turtleback design, essentially reinvent the protected cruiser. But they decided not to go with that on the grounds that if the ship was already damaged, i.e. listing, or had a significant role in heavy seas, it would still expose under the deck to incoming shells, which would be very bad. Bajaki asks, how did Sweden get oil for the Navy in World War II? Primarily by buying it from the United States. So this here is the Swedish tanker Castor, And some of you who are up to date on your Swedish history, or indeed your Royal Navy history, might recognise that Castor was one of the ships involved in the Cylander affair. Video on that either just released or coming up soon, depending on my release schedule. But anyway, Castor would actually be sunk a little bit after the Cylander affair by a U-boat in the mid-Atlantic, because she'd done what she had been doing previously, which was head over to the US, buy a bunch of oil, and was heading back to Sweden to deliver it, except the U-boat decided that, well, either decided to just randomly sink it or possibly didn't recognise that she was a Swedish vessel and put her on the bottom with a spread of torpedoes, which wasn't very helpful, but most of the crew survived. Isomedes asks, it seems like the Swedes managed to pack a little bit of everything into quite a small package and fit it with quite a bit of speed to boost. This is the Swedish destroyers. What compromises did they have to make to achieve this, and what, if any, other navies of the time were building similar small do-it-all destroyers? As far as I'm aware, no one was building quite the same kind of ship as the Swedes. There were destroyers or destroyer-esque vessels in this approximate weight class being built, but they generally were kind of single-purpose ships or had a significant sacrifice. So, for example, early frigates and destroyer escorts were in this weight class, and some of the smaller German torpedo boats, honestly not small destroyers, were also in this weight class. But again, they weren't expected to be all-rounders. Now, in terms of sacrifices that the Swedes had to make, mostly it revolves around range and armament. So range-wise, obviously, they're designed to serve in the Baltic. They're not designed to go particularly long distances. So if you compare the range of the Swedish ships to, say, a Gearing or a Fletcher or a Tribal, they're not going to go as far. And then when you look at armament, most destroyers at the time that these ships are being laid down have a absolute minimum armament of 4 guns. 5 is more typical by the time the Gothenburg or Town and Visby class are being built, and some of them will even have 6, whereas the Swedish destroyers are making do with 3 guns for their main battery. So there's a sacrifice there. And also in terms of their torpedo armament, again, most destroyers of the late 30s and early 40s are at minimum going to be carrying 8 torpedoes, possibly 10 or 12. A couple more in the case of some of the Japanese ships. Whereas, again, the Swedes are making do with 2 triple launchers for a total of 6. So they've slightly downscaled the armament, slightly downscaled the range, and that's allowed them to fit all of it plus speed into a considerably smaller package. This is A.B. Coates asks, who had the better torpedoes in the Russo-Japanese War? And given that, how excessive were Kamchatka's fears of torpedo boats? It's a little bit of an interesting one, because the Russians, at least by the time of the Russo-Japanese War, are generally just using a single type of torpedo, the Type L, which is a 15-inch weapon. Now, that carries a 141-pound charge of TNT with a top range of just under 1,000 yards at 25 knots, which means that it is slightly more capable than the torpedoes found on Japanese torpedo boats of the time, which are Type 32s. Now, the Type 32 can go considerably further, almost 3,000 yards, but at a very low speed, 15 knots. So basically, anything in the Russian fleet can pretty much just outrun the thing. It does have a shorter range setting, 880 yards at 24 knots, but as you can tell, that's sort of midway between the slow and fast settings on the Russian torpedo, and it carries a 110-pound warhead, so somewhat smaller than the Russian torpedo. However, they also have an 18-inch Type 32, which they use on their battleships, whereas the Russians are using the 15-inch on their dreadnoughts, also on their pre-dreadnoughts and their destroyers. The Japanese are using the 14-inch Type 32 on their destroyers, but an 18-inch Type 32 on their dreadnoughts, or pre-dreadnoughts. I don't know why I keep calling them dreadnoughts. Anyway, now that has a bigger warhead, almost 200 pounds, and can go 1,100 yards at 28 knots or 3,300 yards at 15 knots. So, that's a considerably better weapon, unsurprisingly, because it is larger. And they are in the process during the Russo-Japanese War of introducing the 18-inch Type 37, which is effectively the same thing, just a fraction more reliable and a fraction more powerful. But to be honest, it's all much of a muchness, because whether they're Russian torpedoes, Japanese torpedoes, if you're looking at torpedo boats equipped with said torpedoes, you're going to have to get within probably 500 to 600 yards linearly of a ship to actually ensure that your deflection shot with your torpedo is actually going to hit anything. And one would hope that if you're keeping a decent lookout, you could probably spot a torpedo boat well before it gets to 500 yards away from you, but there you go. Now, when it comes to how overblown were the fears of torpedo boats, it's six of one, half dozen of another. On the one hand, some people point out correctly that the Japanese had bought a large number of torpedo boats / early destroyers from various British manufacturers, including Thornycroft and Yarrow, in the relatively recent past. So it wasn't entirely unbelievable that the Japanese might try an emergency buy of torpedo boats that were or destroyers that were under construction at the time. The flip side to that, in terms of an argument, of course, is that the Japanese had, as of a couple of years before the Russo-Japanese War, switched over, as they did with pretty much all the technology that they started off buying from overseas, to building their torpedo boats in their own dockyards in Japan. Now, as I said, you could potentially make an argument and say, oh, well, they were worried, as we just discussed, that maybe the Japanese were going to buy up torpedo boats that were under construction in the UK that hadn't originally been intended for the Imperial Japanese Navy. But honestly, given that they'd had time to plan the voyage of the 2nd Pacific Squadron, the much, much easier way of dealing with those concerns would be, even if you don't necessarily trust what the manufacturers are telling you, given how relatively open naval construction still was in the very early 20th century, either send some people over to the UK or use your existing naval attaché, etc. in the UK, and just go and visit the dockyards that are building torpedo boats, because you can pretty much guarantee that British aren't going to sell torpedo boats and destroyers for the Royal Navy to the Japanese. So you don't need to worry about the Royal Dockyard so much, but you can easily go and visit Thornycroft and Yarrow, even under the pretense of purchasing torpedo boats for yourself, and just see, okay, this is what they are constructing, and then maybe do a follow-up visit or pay someone to keep an eye out and see if any of them have left. And if they haven't, well, then there aren't any torpedo boats at sea that have been recently made, and therefore, regardless of who owns them, you're not under threat. DJ Biscuit asks, why did some nations use dual sizes of torpedoes on submarines? For example, the French Redoutable class and Minerve, they have 550mm torpedoes and also some 400mm torpedoes. What is the possible benefit and reason that France did that? I believe the Italians also had some submarines that did this. You're correct. I mean, the Surcouf as well had mixed caliber torpedoes, and in fact the Italians, with the Cagni class, went with an entirely 18-inch torpedo armament, rather than the 21-inch that is more standard on submarines. The reason for this is essentially that the 21-inch torpedo, or thereabouts, depending on if you're working in metric or imperial, had been devised as the most effective way of ideally sinking, but if not at least crippling, a warship with a single hit. So if you hit a body blow amidships, a single 21-inch torpedo would almost certainly sink a destroyer, would possibly sink a cruiser. You might need a couple of hits, and you might need 3 or 4 to put down a battleship, at least so the theory went, which was fine because you could get a spread of 4 or 6 21-inch torpedoes in the bow of a submarine, at least a relatively large one, or more. But a 21-inch torpedo, 21 inches diameter, is a big, heavy, long, expensive weapon, and usually is very much overkill if you're going after smaller or less durable targets like merchantmen, or indeed possibly even destroyers. And so if you have a little bit of spare space, maybe not enough to fit some additional 21-inch torpedoes, or you are thinking about going after a merchantman quite a bit, like, say, with the Surcouf, it actually then pays to maybe think about sticking some smaller 18-inch torpedoes in, because an 18-inch torpedo will probably do a serious number on a destroyer anyway, definitely do a number on an escort something like a corvette or a frigate or a sloop, and should be enough to do some fairly serious damage to a merchant ship. And of course the advantage of that is being smaller, lighter, cheaper. You can fit either a torpedo and its launcher in a smaller space, or in the same space you can fit more torpedoes, which means you can attack more merchant ships. That was the thinking behind the Cagney class, because they have a ridiculous number of torpedo tubes and can carry, relative to their size, a truly ridiculous number of torpedoes. So, the Cagney's displacement and size-wise are broadly in the same ballpark as American fleet boats. And let's say if you look at a Gator or a Balao, they've got 10 torpedo tubes, 24 torpedoes total. They can fire a salvo of 6 forward or 4 aft, and carry, as I said, 24 torpedoes. The Cagneys have 14 torpedo tubes. They can fire a salvo of 8 forward, as well as another 6 aft, and carry 36 torpedoes. Not because they've got TARDIS-like torpedo magazines, but simply because they're using 18-inch rather than 21-inch torpedoes. So if you're sending a ship out, or a submarine, a boat, out to raid merchant ships, something like a Cagney class in the World War I environment actually makes a certain degree of design sense. It's just that if you go up against something with actual anti-torpedo defences, you might be there a while. Chaos asks, on this topic, that being the battleship generations, I wonder what you think of the Anaxes War College System from Star Wars, which generally rates ships 1,000 years before the Battle of Yavin and onwards, based on their size, because bigger ships means that you can fit more guns on them. I generally rather like the Anaxes War College System, actually. In some ways, it's not that I resent it, but I kind of resent why it had to come about, because you did have this whole thing in the Star Wars fandom going back, a couple of decades at least, which, well, possibly more than that, but a couple of decades ago is when I kind of became aware of it, where you had some people, I guess you call them imperial apologists, trying to say that, oh no, the Star Destroyer, the Imperial Star Destroyer, the 1,600 meter - 1 mile long monster, is the standard, throwaway Imperial ship because it's got the word destroyer in its name, and everyone knows destroyers are the smallest ships in a conventional fleet these days, and therefore everything else in the Imperial fleet is so much bigger and better, and there's some people claiming there are dozens and dozens of executors, i.e. the Super Star Destroyer from Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, and it was all getting a bit silly. And especially when, the movies show that you've got things like the Corellian Corvette and the Nebulon B frigate, and these are all fairly standard ships, and no one's essentially going, if the Star Destroyer was the Star Destroyer, it was the destroyer equivalent, so kind of the Fletcher of its period, then something like a Nebulon B or a Corvette would be the equivalent of a powerboat or a cabin cruiser with guns strapped to it, which is very, again, patently dumb. But this system tries to resolve all of that by saying, no, there's corvettes, there's frigates, there's cruisers, there's heavy cruisers. Then you have Star Destroyers, which are rather blatantly in the position where you would normally have a battleship. Then you have battle cruisers, which are a bit bigger. And then you have the dreadnoughts, i.e. an executor class or similar. Now, this kind of works in a Star Wars setting. Basing things arbitrarily purely on size wouldn't work in a modern naval setting, because you'd end up with problems of, which is more powerful, a battleship or a battlecruiser. The battlecruiser is longer and probably displaces more in a given time period, but the battleship will probably win a fight. And similarly, you can get heavy cruisers or armoured cruisers that are as big or bigger lengthwise, and occasionally approaching displacement-wise, as contemporary battleships, but again would lose to the battleship in a gunfight, and so on and so forth. But in Star Wars, that's less important, because of course in the modern era and in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, all of those issues with ships are mostly predicated around what you need to do to get up to a certain amount of speed, which is due to water resistance and hull form and everything. In space, you don't need to worry about that so much. In space, your protective power in terms of your shielding capacity and your firepower in terms of how many and how big guns you can carry is essentially entirely dependent on your reactor size. How much power can you generate? And well, obviously you've got to get that power to your systems, but fundamentally, if you don't have the power, you can't do certain things. And so, as an approximate guide of saying, well, if it's roughly this size, it should be this. If it's bigger, it should be this. If it's still bigger, it should be this. That actually makes a certain amount of sense, because essentially what you're saying is not so much the ship is this size, but this is the container, and within the container you can fit a reactor of approximately this power output. If it's higher than that, then the reactor's going to be too big and you need to fit it in a bigger hull. So even though the terms used are kind of a mishmash of late 19th century World War I and World War II terms, I'd say it broadly works, although you obviously do have slightly odd things like the Nebulon B, which is relatively long, but volumetrically is actually relatively minimal for a frigate. And also like how the battlecruiser is placed above the Star Destroyer, aka the battleship, mostly on the basis of just sheer length, because as we said, battlecruisers historically were longer than contemporary battleships, even if they weren't necessarily as powerful. And I suppose that's the only slight trip up, that second part of, in the Anaxes War College System, a battlecruiser is larger and more powerful than a Star Destroyer, aka battleship, whereas historically that isn't the case. And of course, then you have various other terms which you'd need to fit into this paradigm, which I know they have done, where you get things like the Mon Calamari Star Cruisers, which, depending on which one you're looking at, whether it's an MC-80 or Home 1 or whatever, they're either Star Destroyer or battle cruiser equivalents, but their size varies quite considerably. Vicky asks, when confronted with the problem of the Type 93 torpedo being too big for their submarine designs to use, why did the Japanese develop smaller long lances instead of bigger submarines? They were far from averse to giant submarines as it was. There's three main factors in play. Firstly, yes, the Japanese weren't averse to building some particularly large submarines, but a bigger submarine costs more, and especially with the Japanese economy and shipbuilding industry, therefore you would have fewer of them, and at some point the cost-benefit analysis starts looking rather bad. So ideally you don't want to build too big a submarine, although, yeah, they did build the I-400s. Secondly, a large submarine, unless you're really clever about how you do things, is going to be more difficult to dive, more difficult to maneuver, and easier to detect. So again, the larger the submarine you get, especially if you're looking at a primarily torpedo-armed submarine, i.e. something that's supposed to go after enemy warships, which is what most of the Japanese Navy subs were supposed to do, you don't necessarily want a big, clumsy, slow-to-dive, hard-to-maneuver, easy target for your opponents as your main fleet attack submarine. The I-400s, in part, kind of get away with this because they're not really supposed to be executing torpedo attacks on people. They're supposed to be using their aircraft from a much further distance. And the last thing is, yep, take a drink, it's our good old friend, the square cube law, back to save us and do many Japanese attempts to put long lances on their subs. Because a long lance is a substantially larger weapon than what they would develop the Type 95 derivative. So to give you some rough idea, a Type 95, that's the submarine launch 21-inch version, is just over 7 meters long, or about 23.5 feet long, and it weighs 1 2/3 tons. Conversely, the Type 93 is 9 meters, or almost 30 feet long, and weighs about 2.7 tons. So you're talking about, if you were going to try and one-for-one replace Type 95s with Type 93s, by going up to 24-inch, you're looking at an extra ton per torpedo. So not including the extra weight you'd need for brackets for such a heavier torpedo, or the bigger torpedo tubes or anything, you're already looking at, if we say take a Type A1 submarine, one of the slightly larger ones, with 18 torpedoes aboard, you're already looking at adding another 18 tons just in terms of weight of torpedoes, which doesn't sound like much, but again, as with destroyers, that's still a fair amount of weight, because that's, apart from anything, another 18 tons of water you're going to have to find, or volume for another 18 tons of water to admit, to balance out the weight of the torpedoes once you've fired them. And given that you're looking at about an additional 7 feet per torpedo, And again, using the A1 as an example, you've got 6 bow tubes, and that's it. So assuming that you've got 6 loaded in your tubes, and then with a total of 18, you've got 2 more sets behind, you're adding a grand total of, well, 7 times 3, because the tubes are going to be a bit longer, plus then the 7 feet of the first set of reloads, plus then the 7 feet of the next set of reloads, not accounting for width. I mean, yes, 21 inch, 24 inch, okay, that's an additional few inches width-wise. That's not so much the concern. The broader concern is you're adding another minimum 21 feet to your forward torpedo compartment, which is going to do some interesting things to the balance of your submarine. So you've got a much longer, much heavier compartment. So you're talking about adding, 6% to the length of your already rather dramatically large submarine, purely to have the room to fit these torpedoes. And then, of course, you've got not just the weight of the brackets and the weight of the torpedo tubes and the additional weight of the torpedoes. You've got the additional weight of the rams and systems to maneuver those torpedoes. And suddenly, you've massively increased the overall size and displacement of your sub just to fit this slightly larger torpedo, which is going to be more difficult to handle in reload and so forth anyway. And I mean, there's also the other factor of if you've already got existing submarines using 21-inch torpedo tubes and you decide to now develop a new class with long lances and you don't develop the Type 95, that means your older subs are going to be stuck using a much older, less capable weapon. Whereas if you develop the Type 95, then at least in theory, you can adapt your existing subs with some relatively minimal changes with a much more improved torpedo. So it just makes a lot more sense that way. Nathan Redder asks, in Drydock episode 218, while you're talking about early Royal Navy breechloaders, there's a picture of a cannon, its carriage, and a whole bunch of metal tracks, squares and circles on the deck. Can you explain these deck markings? Are they pre-planned gun mountings with traverse tracks? Yes, exactly that. So this is a Armstrong 110-pounder on the aft of HMS Warrior. And as you can see, you just have the one gun, but there are multiple potential gun ports. In fact, there are 5 potential gun ports, each marked on the deck by one of these little half circles. And the idea is that the gun can be nice and centrally mounted here, so that gives it a good storage position. It's not adversely affecting the stability of the ship, and it's out of the way of the crew for the most part. But if you need some extra firepower, and you need a stern chaser, or you want to augment the firepower of the port or starboard broadside, you can see that the front of the carriage corresponds with the 2 rings, or tracks, I suppose. They're basically just solid brass strips that arc out kind of like a little fountain. And the back of the carriage is on this kind of U-shaped one that makes it look a little bit like a smiley face. And then you can see you've got little half tracks, or about 3/4 circles, I would say, with the squares on them there to either side of the gun as it is at the moment. So that helps you to further traverse the rear of the gun carriage around. So essentially what you would do if you wanted to maneuver the gun to, say, the port side firing position, that's the one on the furthest right of this picture, is that you would swing the back of the carriage around to the right until it reaches this little half circle, and then the gun is would then be pointing at what relative to our view is about the 10 or 11 o'clock position, and then you can swing the forward part of the gun round on its track, and then that will reach the relevant gun port that we want, which is on our 3 o'clock, and then obviously at that point you have a gun that is technically at the right position, but is pointing pretty much to the 1 o'clock position, so it's going to go and shoot straight through the gunnel. And that's when you can then swing the back part of the carriage along the next big track. So that's kind of immediately to the right of the gun as it is at the moment. It's a kind of, I'd say, 1/4, 1/3 circle that's radiating out from that gun port. And then at that point, your gun is now aligned with the gun port. So if you need to traverse it, it can traverse back and forth along that track. But then if you needed to move it further, you'd swing it around using the other track systems. The little square plates, if I'm remembering correctly from when I was there, are the pivot points. So obviously you can swing the gun carriage. I mean, it's still going to take a few men to do, but you can swing the gun carriage around on these various tracks. But then once you've got it into the position you want it to be, there's a little sort of key lock system on those square plates, which then allows you to kind of fix the front of the gun carriage to that point. So it will now pivot around that point rather than just slewing around all over on the tracks. Adrian Beale asks, some historical refits seem great investments, like Warspite and so forth. Some refits that never happened probably should have, like Hood, but there's a lot of refits that seem to be more marginal. What are some of the worst refits done that would have been better served by a realistic alternative? And what are some of the biggest missed opportunities where a refit would have made all the difference? Well, some of it is situational, because there are refits which were done, but in the event turned out to be not really worth all that much. The refit itself may or may not have been a good thing, but circumstances conspired against it. So, for example, Barham, seen here, and Malaya had a series of refits during the interwar period, but they didn't have the mostly modernization program of Warspite or the full modernization of Queen Elizabeth and Valiant. And so when it came to World War II, they were significantly less capable than the other three ships, and to various degrees suffered for it. I mean, Barham's being hit by multiple torpedoes wasn't really to do with its refit or modernization or lack thereof, but they were generally viewed as, almost on a par with the Revenge class as opposed to the other three of their class. But that's not necessarily a reflection of saying the refits were bad. It's a reflection of the refits weren't enough for the time that they were thrust into war. And similarly, in the mid-1930s, Royal Oak had a fairly extensive modernisation, nowhere near as much as Warspite, Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, but it made her, at least on paper, a fairly useful second-line capital ship. Perhaps, this might be a bit controversial, but perhaps even more capable than Barham and Malaya were. But then she got torpedoed by U-47, and that meant that the other Revenge class were obviously the ones that then served during World War II, and they were all substantially less updated than Royal Oak. So the refit itself was good, but turned out to be fairly pointless because she was gone in the first few months of the war. The flip side is you have absolutely terrible refits that were probably best just not done because they badly impinged on the ship in some way. An example of that will probably be the modernisation of HMS London, a county-class cruiser that was done just before the Second World War. In theory, the overall idea was good, modernising some of the older of the county class, which, to be fair, they were getting a little old at that point. But they tried to do far too much and didn't remove anywhere near as much to compensate for it, and the poor thing ended up overloaded and repeatedly had damage from its hull straining under too much weight. So, yeah, probably could have done with just a more standard county class refit there. But in terms of places where a refit might have made all the difference and wasn't done for various reasons, thus a missed opportunity, there's a lot. Repulse being refitted to Renown standard would be one, because while Britain was rearming quite significantly in the mid to late 1930s, the Treasury, being the semi-traitorous elements of the country that they are, basically went, we're heading for war and everything, but you have to do it cheaply. We're going to really yank back on the budgets that everybody is saying we need to have to properly be ready for war. And as a result, although there were hard industrial limits on how quickly you could build new capital ships, so there wasn't really much chance of increasing production rate of the King George V's Lions-Vanguard beyond eventually 3 battleships laid down per year, refitting existing ships could be done at a much greater rate. There were plenty of available dry docks and so forth, if the money was available. But the Treasury went, nope, we don't want that. I mean, bearing in mind, these are the same idiots who tried to reduce ammunition expenditure and gun armament on RAF fighters in the middle of the Battle of Britain. Sometimes I think the Luftwaffe missing the major Treasury departments was perhaps their greatest crime. But in any case, a repulse refitted to renowned standards with all those lovely 4.5-inch heavy AA guns and plenty of pom-poms and so forth, probably could have broken up the Japanese air attack that came after her when she was part of Force Z, if not necessarily enough to also save Prince of Wales, because she was, doing her own thing, at least enough to break up the accidental pincer that formed that eventually actually got her. At least enough to maybe only take 1 or 2 torpedo hits, because of course the renowned refit includes improved torpedo defences. Another missed opportunity would have been perhaps the refitting of the Omaha-class cruisers into anti-aircraft cruisers. If that had been done, let's say, starting in 37-38, given that the US doesn't enter the war till the end of 41, a good chunk of those might have come out, covered in 5-inch 38s, and, well, initially 1.1-inch and so forth, but later 20mm and 40mm. Now, I'm not necessarily saying it would make massive differences, but in the early part of the war, if they could then have been available for, say, something like Coral Sea or Midway to provide heavier anti-aircraft escort for the carriers, it might have saved Lexington and Yorktown. And if Lexington and Yorktown are then still around, then that makes it easier to save Hornet as well during the Guadalcanal campaign. Reichsbeer Minister asks, I often find myself looking up stuff while I'm listening to the dry docks, and man, there's some rabbit holes to get lost in. So have you ever considered producing a basic series of naval-style how and why videos, like 10 to 20 minutes on all the sails on a sailing vessel, what they do, what they're named, why they're named that way, and so on and so forth? Is that something you could put on a fixed schedule, or perhaps for a deep dive video? It's certainly something I could consider doing. 10 to 15 minutes, probably, it's a short format, but something that may be suited for Fridays, for example. The main thing would be coming up with a coherent list of what to put on how and why videos. So, you mentioned, what are all the sails on a sail ship and how are they named? Or I suppose you could do something about what are the various ways in which Age of Sail ships were built, clinker style, Carvel style, etc. What kinds of propulsion systems do steamships use over time? Vertical triple expansion and steam turbines, geared turbines, that kind of stuff. These are all possibilities, but I'd need to come up with some kind of list to do in some kind of coherent order to do them in. So maybe I'll put that out to a Patreon poll or something, or just a Q&A, like list all the things you'd like to see a 10 to 15 minute how and why video on. Well, that'll give me some ideas to get going. The other thing which I'm also thinking of doing, so let me know in the comments below if you'd be interested in me doing it, and which I have sort of been preparing scripts for a while, is that while obviously most of the videos on the channel are looking at a specific ship, specific battle, or development, something like that, for obvious reasons, because we're looking in a little bit more depth, I haven't really done a kind of, this was World War I, or this was World War II, even from the perspective of a specific navy, which is the kind of thing that you would sometimes see on places like the History Channel and the Discovery Channel back when they actually did actual history content. So one of the things I've been thinking of doing is perhaps let's start with World War II, doing a series of videos which would cover in about an hour, so kind of your standard old documentary length, the Naval War kind of edited highlights edition for each major navy involved. So initially start off obviously with the Germans, Italians, Japanese, British and Americans, although you could, I suppose, expand that to incorporate the Russians or the Soviets at the time and the French, but start off maybe with the big 5 navies. And because it would be obviously an edited highlights thing, because if for the navies that are at least involved in the war from start to finish, you're essentially talking about, 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, 45. You're basically giving 7 to 10 minutes per year. And, okay, the Japanese and the Americans, you can give maybe a quarter of an hour per year, but covering an entire year's development in that short time, not really that easy, but could be done. And my additional idea for that would be to identify a co-host for each of those, obviously appropriate to the nation. So get an American historian to sort of co-host with me for the American one, another British historian to do the British one, German for German, Italian for Italian, so on and so forth, and then produce it a little bit. It'd be a little bit sort of more expensive, longer to produce than a normal video, because I'd be doing the talking heads, the little captions, lots of probably licensed footage and everything, but it would give you a kind of a 1 hour overview of this was World War II for this navy, and maybe give some launching off points for separate videos later on. Is that something people would be interested in me doing? Because obviously it would be a fair bit of work tracking down the relevant historians, doing all the appropriate filming and editing and so forth. But if there's enough interest, it might be worth considering. And that those be like standalone things to help people, get a general gist of what was going on before they go and look at specific campaigns and battles, which have their own videos that are just as long. Killer Rabbit asks, what are some historical equivalents of aircraft carriers are obsolete? Yeah, something like this happens on a disturbingly regular basis in naval history. Essentially, it's a failure of imagination or a failure of critical thinking on the part of the person who says it, and usually that's, assuming that they're not being malicious, and so we're being a bit generous to them. And it's the similar kind of thinking you see with, shall we say, a lot of the more enthusiastic but very simplistic, but if only X had done Y, they could have won War Z kind of scenarios, If the Germans had sailed with Tirpitz and Bismarck, as well as Prince Eugen, to Denmark Strait, then they could have. If Germany had completed Force Z, it's usually the Germans for some bizarre reason, if the Japanese had shown up with 6 carriers at Midway, something like that. The fundamental problem with both those scenarios and with the insert ship classes obsolete is that it assumes maximum favourable condition for the side who you're making alterations to, and assumes that the other side is so catastrophically brain dead that they are not changing anything. So, using the usual German World War II tropes, if the Germans had built 300 U-boats, they would have won the Battle of the Atlantic. But yes, maybe if the Royal Navy had done nothing about it, but realistically the Royal Navy probably would have started building a lot more anti-submarine escorts a lot sooner. If the Germans had sailed with turbines, Tovey wouldn't have kept King George V and Victorious back if there were 2 German battleships and heavy cruisers sailing out. If the Japanese had sent Shikaku and Suikaku out, or at least maybe Zuikaku out to Midway, but it's very unlikely Nimitz would have risked that confrontation at that point, etc., etc. And the same thing with, these ships are obsolete. It assumes that there is no further improvement or capability gain to be made with the class that is now under threat from insert new problem here. So this is the reason we've got this picture up, when the torpedo boat came out, everyone was like, yes, well, clearly the battleship is obsolete because the torpedo boat can sink it. And then, the people with the battleships went, but what if we put a bunch of quick-firing guns on the battleships so that we shoot you before you get close enough to us? And also we put a perimeter of cruisers around us, and we invent the torpedo boat destroyer. And suddenly the battleship isn't quite so obsolete. That it doesn't diminish. Well, it somewhat diminishes. It doesn't negate the threat of the torpedo boat, but it makes it manageable, and then there are a whole load of other things that you do need battleships for that torpedo boats can't do, and suddenly the battleship isn't obsolete. There was a similar kind of scare when shell guns were invented, so shell-firing guns, that is. People were going, oh yes, well, now we need a little brigs and sloops armed with a few big shell guns apiece. They can take apart a ship of the line, and, well, it turns out you just put shell guns, except bigger and more of them, on ships of the line, and maybe some shrapnel rounds as well, and suddenly the survival chances of your tiny little gunboat squadron don't look so good, do they? And there was that whole transition into armoured warships as well. Once shell guns and so forth had gotten bigger and shells had improved, and people were like, oh no, now the shell gun renders the capital ship obsolete. At which point France and Britain just went, or we could put some iron plate on our ships, and suddenly these shells are very ineffective. And thus starts the ironclad race, and it turns out, once again, big capital ships were not obsolete. Or, admittedly, it didn't happen so much at the time, but some people try to retroactively apply this. People are like, oh yeah, the War of 1812 proved that 6th rate and 5th rate frigates were obsolete, and now only the big 24-pounder super frigate was the thing to have. Well, no, it proved that you needed some 24 or even 32-pounder frigates to deal with potential enemy super frigates, but frankly, that kind of ship was far too large and far too expensive for taking over the role of all frigates, and so what you ended up was adding another layer of frigate to your frigate collection, but there was still a ton of smaller frigates running around all through the early part of the 19th century, all the way up to the mid part, doing all sorts of ancillary roles, and just with maybe a big frigate or two somewhere nearby to call on in case someone else showed up with their big frigate. Much like torpedo boats, submarines were supposed to make surface warships generally obsolete. Then surface warships developed anti-submarine techniques. The flip side to that is ASDIC-sonar was then also supposed to make submarines obsolete, and it turns out that, well, even while sonar improves, submarines got stealthier and deeper diving and better torpedoes and so on and so forth, and, well, that arms race is still continuing to this day. So essentially, before people go declaring X obsolete in the face of Y, you have to consider, well, what can that thing do to modify itself to deal with the potential threat? So, these days everyone's like, stealth aircraft. Great, fantastic. Works against the most common kinds of radar used in a military application. That doesn't mean radar and surface-based missile defenses are obsolete. It just means that people are going to start working on other ways of tracking aircraft. So eventually we will get to a point where radar stealthed aircraft are now detectable again. It won't necessarily be by the kinds of radar they're specifically proofed against, but it might be by some other detection system, whether that be, long-wave radar, infrared, some kind of extremely long-range LiDAR, or whatever. Who knows? But a counter will eventually exist. And the same thing with, nowadays aircraft carriers in the face of supersonic or hypersonic ballistic missile threats and so forth. Well, jamming, lasers, better escorts, some additional self-defense weapons, potentially lasers, on the carriers, longer range naval strike aircraft, better degradation of enemy coordination and fire control assets. All of these things are possible to, essentially slightly modify the profile of an aircraft carrier to make it far less vulnerable to current threat. And drones are essentially a repeat of the torpedo boat problem. Brad in SoCal asks, in World War II there was a huge increase in shipbuilding. Can you remind us how they initiated that, and were they successful? Well, I think degrees of success depends on which nation you're looking at, because pretty much all the major nations involved in World War II did get their shipyards to produce considerably more ships than they had done in peacetime, with the potential exception of the Soviet Union, who faced the rather dramatic problem of Germans just being in those shipyards, which didn't really help the situation all that much. But obviously the European powers, so Britain, Germany and Italy, for the ones that were in the war for any significant amount of time, they faced some additional challenges depending on which side you're on, the other side was trying to bomb your facilities constantly, which somewhat mitigated your capabilities of expanding shipyard production. And, of course, especially in the case of Britain and Germany, them being in the war from the very start, a lot of their shipyards were very quickly being filled with damaged ships, which somewhat mitigated on your ability to construct new ones. Whereas US shipyards were pretty much invulnerable to enemy attack during World War II, and the Japanese yards, for a good chunk of World War II, were also pretty much invulnerable to enemy attack. But the differences there were economy. The Japanese were expanding their shipyard capability, expanding their shipyards to fit things like the Yamatos, but they faced very real hard limits on what they could do in the form of both finance and industrial capacity. So although their shipbuilding efforts did go up, they were pretty much running into a very hard limit on what they could physically do. The US, although it did run into certain limits with things like the availability of geared turbines and eventually the availability of the correct grades of steel, had a much greater, if you like, market cap or build cap to their industry. And the US, apart from having pretty much invulnerable infrastructure, did have the additional advantage of, oh, look, a war is happening. We should probably try and prepare for that. And then getting essentially the rest of 39, all of 1940 and most of 1941, where they could continue to upgrade their infrastructure, continue to lay down ships and essentially running the economy on a wartime expansion basis without actually being at war, and thus having to expend vast amounts of material and replace lost ships and repair damaged ships and so on and so forth. That's one of the reasons, for example, why they're perfectly happy to repair HMS Warspite in the middle of 1941 at Bremerton, because, well, they've got the spare capacity. But when it comes to repairing and refitting HMS Nelson towards the end of the war, they're not quite so keen, because now they have their own ships to worry about repairing and refitting. But in the major success cases, because Italy and Germany also hit certain caps on what they could physically, economically do, and the fact they hadn't really had massive shipbuilding industries in the past, the Germans had a somewhat larger shipbuilding industry than Italy, but it was kind of grown up very, very quickly and then gone away very quickly after World War I, so they had a lot of expertise issues. Italy had probably overall more expertise available to them, but less suitable infrastructure. And they didn't really have the economy or the ambition to try and expand on to a truly massive degree, whereas both Britain and America had huge shipbuilding industries and all the remains of huge shipbuilding industries, and they were thus in a far better position to expand them. And seeing that there was a big conflict coming, starting to put funding into reopening, expanding, and improving infrastructure before the war actually broke out. But as I mentioned before in a previous question, even then, especially in the UK, there were significant treasury restrictions which hampered them from doing exactly what they wanted. And that meant that as the war went on, you had things like, we've got the physical space to put the ships, but because there wasn't enough money available to train up the manpower, we're now facing skilled manpower limits. So, for example, in the mid to latter part of the war, there was a choice between, well, we can put a bunch of people working on the Implacable or on Vanguard, but we can't do both. We have to make a decision, where do we put the skilled ship workers? That was not down to the capacity of the shipyard itself, because there were both ships on the stocks. That was down to lack of treasury investment in the run-up to World War II and the failure to recruit and train enough skilled labourers. But essentially, if you want to have a huge increase in shipbuilding immediately before and during a war, you need to start preparing half a decade or more before that. And you can't do it in half measures. And finally for this week, Nosdomu89 asks, what can you tell us about the battle between HMS Raglan and Goeben? Well, very briefly, at the end of World War I, there is still obviously hostilities going on between the Allies and the Ottomans. The Gallipoli campaign has wrapped up, but the British are still keeping what they've termed the Aegean Squadron in the area to essentially contain the Ottoman fleet. Now, they're not taking the Ottoman threat massively seriously, to be fair. The sum total of the heavy guard forces are the two Lord Nelson-class semi-dreadnoughts, so Lord Nelson and Agamemnon. And at the time, they also have the Raglan, which is an Abercrombie-class monitor using one of the 14-inch gun turrets that had originally been intended for the Greek dreadnought Salamis, and a smaller monitor, the M28, which has a 9.2-inch gun as its main armament. Obviously, they're coastal bombardment ships, and a couple of destroyers and a few other ships around, but essentially their job is to occasionally shoot at the Ottomans in the Dardanelles for general, go-away purposes, and to stop the Ottoman fleet getting out into the Mediterranean and supporting the Ottoman forces that are in the Middle East, which are currently not having the best of times. Now, all of this is relatively quiet duty, relative to the rest of the naval war of World War I, until the Ottomans decide, well, one of those British semi-dreadnoughts has gone off doing who knows what, and the other one is slightly out of position, so why don't we do a raid out of the Dardanelles to try and relieve some pressure on our forces further south? So out goes the Goeben and the Breslau, now renamed Yavut Sultan Selim and Midilli, and they shoot up a few Allied installations, and they come across the port or harbour of Imbros, hence the Battle of Imbros, which is where one of the British destroyers and the Raglan and the M28 are based. One of the British semi-dreadnoughts is at Mudros, which is a little bit further away, so is unable to assist. And, well, another British destroyer shows up. They try to save the monitors, but the monitors initially look and go, well, we don't have much armour, we don't have anywhere near the speed, so our first instinct is to try and escape, except they're also very slow, so they can't. The British destroyers try to get close enough to launch torpedoes, but there's too much fire from the two Ottoman ships, the ex-German ships. They try and lay a smoke screen. That doesn't work through a combination of placement and weather. And even though theoretically, at least Raglan, as you can see here in this picture of her, does have a fire control top and therefore could return fire with her 14-inch guns, which would be a significant threat to Goeben, she doesn't really get around to actually doing that much before Goeben actually starts landing hits. One of the first hits from Goeben actually knocks out her fire control station, and then, well, slow, relatively unprotected targets, it's not very much of a surprise that Raglan is hit, disabled, knocked out, set on fire and sunk. M28 set on fire and sunk as well. The Ottomans are then kind of going, well, this has gone surprisingly well for us. There is a bit of an air battle going on above them as well, but they conclude that, well, they've done enough for one day, let's head home before one or more of the British battleships shows up again. And they decide to withdraw. Unfortunately for them, they withdraw straight into a minefield, and the two British destroyers, which they haven't managed to sink, are kind of following them going, yes, please continue through this area of sea, we would dearly love for you to do this, and oh look, there's the mines. Isn't this great? Breslau hits multiple mines and sinks. Goeben hits a couple of mines and is badly damaged, and is now making desperately for the Dardanelles, a bit of a table turn for them. And the two British destroyers follow, and they're thinking about torpedoing Goeben to finish her off, except the Ottomans basically sortie a good chunk of what's left of their fleet out to not necessarily drive the British destroyers off, as it turns out, but basically hold them off long enough for Goeben to get under the cover of the Ottoman shore batteries. She then runs aground and has to be hauled off for repairs, and essentially what had been initially a very, very decisive victory for the Ottoman Navy turns into something of a score draw, if not a loss, because, well, the most modern cruiser is at the bottom of the ocean, or the Mediterranean Sea technically, and their capital ship is now basically out of action for a fairly long time. And while the British destroyers are commended for doing pretty much all they could do, the overall admiral in charge is severely criticised for leaving his somewhat vulnerable monitors completely exposed, because it's pointed out, and quite rightly, that Goeben, given her experiences fighting the Russian pre-dreadnought squadron earlier in the war, probably wouldn't have even tried to engage had Lord Nelson and Agamemnon been there, and even if one or the other had been there, even if they'd fought a delaying action or at least shown up roughly on time, then even if Raglan and M28 had been sunk and they'd only shown up afterwards, once Goeben had been crippled by those mines, Lord Nelson and Agamemnon would have been more than capable of finishing her off. So, yeah, it wasn't the best showing for the British, except for whoever had laid that rather useful minefield, and for the Ottomans it was all going really, really well until suddenly it wasn't. And that brings us to the end of this week's Drydock, which ran a little bit over time, but thank you very much for continuing to listen, and I hope to see you again in another video soon. Cheers, and bye.